Good evening. It's 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. It's time for us to start our Bible study tonight from the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think that the topic that we'll be discussing this evening is one that several of us in this area have been dealing with here recently, and that is living today as if it were the last day, enjoying every minute of our lives. So Solomon has come to a place in his life where he is recognizing that he has failed. He has failed miserably in trying to find the meaning of life and trying to find happiness. The question that I ask for us to consider tonight is how many times do you have to bang your head against the wall before you realize that what you're doing, the direction that you're headed in, is not the right one? So he has been dealing with finding happiness through materialism. He had this attitude that the more money you have, the more toys you have, the better off you'll be, the happier you'll be in this life. And, in the first few chapters, he really destroyed that notion by telling us that he had everything. There was nothing that was withheld from him, both in wisdom and financially. And then he had all of these men and women that would come and entertain him. He was an environmentalist. He was a zookeeper. He was in horticulture. He did everything. And still couldn't find happiness. So he debunked that. He debunked the idea that if I can get more stuff, have a bigger house, larger bank account. Remember when the Queen of Sheba came to visit, and he showed her his storehouses of gold and silver and diamonds and rubies. And she goes back and tells folks in her country that the half has not even been told. And still we find this man depressed. We find him lonely. We find him so sad. Why do grandparents enjoy the grandchildren more than they did their own children? Could it be because when you have your own children, you're spending a lot of time working? You're too busy with busy things and not busy enough in spending time with your children and going to the ball games and tossing a frisbee and holding your children. But once they're grown and gone, you have nothing to look back on. In other words, you can't go back and redeem that time. And now with grandchildren, you spend the time that you wish you'd spend with your children. You spend it with them. You do the things that you wish you had done with your children, with your grandchildren. And this is Solomon here. And then he also thought, well, if I can't find pleasure or happiness in my material possessions, maybe if I seek pleasures in women. He had, about 700 concubines, 300 wives. He still wasn't happy. He wasn't fulfilled. Here's a man that had 1,000 women at his disposal, and many more if he wanted them. But instead of being happy, he was a very depressed man. Instead of being feeling that he had a relationship, he was lonely. How can it be that a man with 1,000 women in his harem felt lonely? Because he didn't have a meaningful relationship with any of them. He even thought that if he couldn't find happiness in materialism and in sex, then maybe he could find it in wine and liquor. And he realized that wasn't the answer to what he was looking for. So he turns to what's called humanism, right? Where I worship myself, where I'm going to depend on my strength, on my mind, the attitude that I know better than God, and therefore I'll do it my way. Remember that Paul Anka, Frank Sinatra song, My Way? And, if we try to find the meaning of life, and we try to find direction that will lead us to heaven through material possessions or having this playboy attitude or humanism, we're going to be left with the last thing that Solomon was dealing with, and that's fatalism. And the word fatalism it has to do with fatality, with death. In this case, it has to do with desperation. That since he couldn't find happiness, if he couldn't find the meaning of life in any of these areas, then he said, then why even try? Everything is vanity, vanity of vanities. A relationship with a partner is useless. Having a castle is useless. And he says, I can't find happiness in anything. You know, a fatalist is someone that sees the glass is half empty. The fatalist is the one that is afraid and nervous about everything, and that if anything can go wrong, will go wrong. Well, this is Solomon at this point, because he's been looking for the answer not in God, but everything underneath the heavens is where he was looking for the answer. He was looking for the answer here on earth, and he just was depressed. He was truly, truly sad. And it's really a sad sight when we read the book of Ecclesiastes, because we see here a man with great potential, and everything up to this point had gone to pot. And it is truly sad. So he gives us in Ecclesiastes 9, in the first 6 verses, 4 realities of life, 4 things that he finally realizes. He says, I have taken all this to my heart and explained it that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. What is he saying in that phrase? He says, I finally realized that it doesn't matter how much money I have or how many children I might, none of those things matter, because I can't add an hour of life or a year or a day of life to extend my longevity on this earth. I can't do that. The wise man, the right, no one can. Man does not know whether it will be love or hatred. Anything awaits him. So he says to us, first of all, God is in control. Our life is in the hands of God. And I know that many of us have a hard time with this concept, because when someone like me says that God is in control and that he knows the day of our birth and the day of our death, as if God is controlling when we die, as if God said, okay, today this person's going to die. That's not what God being in control means, although he can do that if he wants to. But what it means that God is in control is that, as James points out, our life is like a vapor. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. The only one that knows is God. And if we are truly believers in God, if we truly have faith, when we are asking God to deliver us from evil, deliver us from temptation, or heal us of an illness, if we don't believe that he can intervene and do it, then we're praying without faith, and we shouldn't pray. Remember the song, He's Got the Whole World in His Hands? Children's song. That's the attitude that we need to have. And when we give up control and turn it over to God, our life will be better. Things will fall in place. We won't be resisting. We won't be trying to control everything. And that's human nature, isn't it? That we want to be in control of every aspect of our lives, of what happens in our homes, in our businesses, in our community, in our country. We want to be in control of everything. We want to have the answers for everything. But we need to step back and accept the fact that indeed God has a whole world in his hands. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, so that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? Now, you might recognize this passage because it's found in 2 other places in the Bible. It is in the Psalms, where David is praying this, that I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. That's David understanding that God has promised to be with him and that God would never, ever abandon, forsake Jesus or forsake David. Well, we also find it in the New Testament as Jesus is hanging on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, did God abandon his son? Well, some might be tempted to say yes. If he did, then this passage is not true. God didn't abandon his son, but God was not going to intervene to deliver Jesus from the cross. Remember when Jesus prayed, if it be your will, let this cup pass? But then he resigned himself and said, Father, let not my will be done, but yours. And God didn't abandon him. It was part of the plan that he would die on the cross. Well, notice how this passage is applied to us in Hebrews 13. If we are depending upon money to make us happy, he's telling us, make sure that your character is free from the love of money. Unfortunately, we live in a society where money talks, where money controls. There's a Mexican saying that with money, even the dog will dance. But we as Christians shouldn't be caught up with this idea of filthy lucre. We shouldn't be so intertwined with money that once it's gone, then our life is lost. This is why the Hebrew writer says you need to learn how to be content with what you have, because God has said, where should our hope be placed in? Where should we place our faith? In God, because he has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, so that we can with confidence say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. And what can man do to me? What is the worst that man can do to you? Take your life, right? And this is why Jesus has said in the Gospels, don't be afraid of the man that can kill your body. The one that you need to fear is the one that can take both your life or destroy both your life and your soul in Sheol or Hades. So the worst that can happen to us is what happened to Jesus, crucified. But then what was the result, or what happened after Jesus was crucified? On the third day, he resurrected and was set at the right hand of God. Solomon was having a very difficult time relying on God and being content. Everything his eyes saw, he wanted. Everything his heart desired, he had to have. And he was left empty because his faith, his reliance was not on God, but on himself, on his own will. James says, the brother of Jesus, come now, in James 4, verse 13, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. But you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. I would assume that most of you that are tuning in and studying James or Ecclesiastes with us tonight can point to one or two or maybe more people in your lives that didn't expect to die that day, and that death was sudden, unexpected. James is saying, if you are relying on yourself, on your profit, on your business or whatever, you're fooling yourself because you don't know what's going to happen. Instead of making plans for the future as if God was not in charge, you ought to say, the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. That phrase, the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that, I believe it simply means this. Make sure that I am living according to the word of God. Make sure that I fear the Lord, that I'm doing his will. And then there's nothing else to fear, because if the Lord wills, he will allow me to live more, or if he doesn't, he won't. But in the end, he will never forsake me. What we read there in Hebrews 13, he will always be with us. And Solomon gives me the impression that he was afraid to go to sleep at night. There were several things that kept him awake. Some of the things was trying to figure out the meaning of life when all he had to do was turn to the Lord. Another thing that kept him awake at night was not knowing who would inherit all of his possessions, and if his children would take advantage and use what he left them for good, or if they would squander it. But I believe the real reason that Solomon couldn't sleep at night was because he was afraid of dying and not doing what God wanted him to do. The second reality that Solomon expresses in Ecclesiastes 9 is there is an appointment that we all have to keep, right? Death is certain. Both the young and the old die, the poor and the wealthy, the ignorant and the wise. Everyone will have to taste death unless we're alive when the Lord returns. But it is appointed that man will die and then face the judgment. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 2, it is the same for all. And with that one phrase, friends, with that one phrase, if you mark your Bible and write in it, this is a phrase that you might want to highlight. It is the same for all. Now, what is the same for all? I know that he's talking about death, but what else is the same for all? When we connect this with what the Hebrew writer says here shortly, you'll also notice that the same fate is going to fall everyone, that is death and judgment, right? For we must all appear before the judgment seat of God. The book will be open, and everything in our lives that we've done, said, or thought will be read and will be judged according to God's word. So the same fate, death and judgment, is for everyone. There is one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and for the unclean, for the man who offers a sacrifice and for the one who does not even care about God, the one that doesn't even offer a sacrifice. As a good man is, so is the sinner. As a swearer is, so is the one who is afraid to swear. His point is, everyone dies. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that there is one fate for all men. I believe that if Solomon was a theologian in the New Testament, we would call this doctrine the doctrine of salvation by works. Because Solomon is saying, I don't think it's fair that the good person, the one that has compassion, the one that loves his neighbor, respects his parents, and all those things, is also going to die just like the thief, the murderer, the swindler. The religious one that offers a sacrifice will die just like the one that's not religious. And he says, to me, that's an evil. It's just not right. So if it's not right, then why is Solomon still relying on himself and not on God? He's working himself up to finally letting go and letting God. There's many scriptures. We could read the scriptures there in Genesis and the Psalms, in James 4:14, Ecclesiastes 12:7, that talks to us about or reminds us that we're going to die. That's going to teach us that it's inevitable. Our bodies were made perfect, but because of sin, God said to Adam and Eve, the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. And the world was cursed, and man had to die. We come to Noah and the ark, Noah and the people of that day, how God made sure that man would not live beyond 120 years anymore, because man is evil. Man was corrupt continually. So he destroyed the world with the worldwide flood, and then gave us a second chance through Noah. And then we have Sodom and Gomorrah. It's just that's the way we are. And because of sin in the sinful world that we live in, that's broken and corrupt, we all have to die. There's no way around it. There are some wealthy folks that have paid an exorbitant amount of money that when they die, their body is frozen until science had come up with a cure for whatever disease killed them so that they can be revived. Let me assure you this about life and death. Once the soul leaves the body, even if doctors through machinery are able to keep that heart pumping and with the ventilator make the body breathe, the body's dead. if it once the soul leaves, the body's dead. And Solomon is so concerned about the rich and the poor, the ignorant and the wise, the godly and the ungodly having the same fate. And this is why he says death, this is something evil. And yes, death is an evil reality of life. It is painful. It is extremely emotional. And it's a consequence for the broken world that we live in. Ponce de Leon, remember that story when you were in grade school? Ponce de Leon wanted to find the fountain of youth that supposedly it was somewhere in Florida. He should have just gone to Hollywood where he could have gotten plastic surgery, because there's many people that think that by undergoing plastic surgery, you'll look young and maybe feel young and maybe be young. But no, we can't add a day to our life. Only God knows the day of our birth and the day of our death. And unfortunately, when someone leaves us, when someone succumbs to death, one of our loved ones, it is painful, but it is a reality. And this is what's really bothering Solomon. We all have to die. And the third reality that Solomon speaks about there in the last part of verse 3 is that without God, humans are mean. And think about that. I've often said that if it were not for the fact that I am a Christian and that I have a relationship with God and that I must be accountable to God, if it were not that I know what the consequences of sin is, if there was no God, then I wouldn't do the things that I do. I'd be mean. I'd be selfish, more so than than I am already. And Solomon is saying this, that when God is not at the center of your life, there is no love, true love. I share this text with some of my friends who are atheists, and they're quick to say to me, no, we don't have to have God to know what love is. We can, we love our spouses, we love our children. And I say to them, you think that you love your spouses and your children. If you're an atheist, you love the physical part of your wife, your husband, and your children. You don't love the soul because you don't believe in the soul. And this is why we know that what love is, because God loved us first by giving us his son to die on the cross. Without God, what restrains us? Furthermore, he says in verse 3, the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil, and insanity is in their hearts throughout their lives. Afterwards, they go to the dead. How much strife do you think we could avoid in this life if we were indeed a Christian home, if we were indeed a Christian country, if indeed people lived their faith? But what we see on the streets, on the news, on social media is insanity, it's hatred, anger, vile, because folks don't have God in their lives. The author of our workbook makes a point that our society is so backwards that you can neglect a dog, leave a dog tied outside in the heat without water or food for a day or two, and you'd go to jail. But it's the same society that says that you can abort as many children as you want, kill them inside the womb as long as you don't kill them outside the womb. And Solomon makes this point in verse 3. When he says that the humans are mean and full of insanity without God, this is what should make us insane. Knowing that one day we will die, and not living with that fear today. In other words, insanity is that knowing that that everyone has to die and not making preparations for the afterlife. That's insanity. That's crazy. 2 Peter 3 verse 11, in describing how the world is going to be destroyed with fire and all those things, Peter says, since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, since the world, the firmament, everything's going to be destroyed with fire, he says, since you know these things, what kind of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Since you know that you're going to die, since you know that you're going to face judgment, since you know that God is a righteous God, that he will avenge, that he will punish the unrighteous and will reward the righteous, what kind of people should you be? We ought to be living in such a way that we're making preparations to live in heaven. And another thing that Solomon says is certain, is for sure. It's found in verses 4 through 6 when he says that with God, there is hope. So there is no hope in material possessions and in having a fatalist attitude or humanism or in the pleasures of life. He says that's not hope. Hope is that sustains us, that gives us strength and encouragement in moments of fear and anxiety. Hope is knowing and believing wholeheartedly, as we read in Hebrews 13, that God will not abandon us, that he will be with us. But imagine those that don't have God in their lives. What hope do they have? It's sad, isn't it? Over the last 2 years, I've preached too many funerals. And I thank God that most of those funerals were for people that had a hope, that lived a life dedicated to the Lord, that their attitude was to please God and make him a priority. But there have been a couple that they didn't live that way. And that's sad. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 4, for whoever is joined with all the living, there is hope. Surely a live dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know they will die, but the dead do not know anything, nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten. Indeed, their love, their hate, and their zeal have already perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun. If you recall, in Luke's gospel, he spoke about the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man who is suffering in torment because he lived a life that was that his hope was in his money and his pleasures and did not believe in God, did not do as God wanted him to do. He's begging Abraham, send someone from the dead to go talk to my brothers. And basically Abraham says, you know, once you're dead, you have no more business to carry on in the world. And, you know, that's a reality. Another reality is that once we die, our fate is sealed. Now, I want you to think about that. While we have life, we have time and opportunity to make things right with God. But once we die, however, in whatever condition we died in, that's our fate. So Solomon says, what use is to have a dead lion, you know, the king of the jungle? It's better to have a live dog that will at least bark and wag its tail than a dead lion. You know, as long as you have time on this earth, you have time to obey the gospel. But once we die, there remains no more hope if we die unfaithful. Hebrews 9 verse 27 teaches us that it is appointed for man to die once and then the judgment. He makes this point about, you know, there's no more memory. right? After one dies. You know, Solomon is not making a theological argument about is one conscious after they, you know, after you die, do you know what's going on? Well, what I mentioned to you about the rich man and Lazarus, there we are conscious. But what Solomon is saying here is, after we're dead, after we leave this earth, there's going to come a time when our loved ones won't think about us every day. We won't share in the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays and meals anymore because we won't be here. So I think Solomon might be reaching for this conclusion. One, make sure that you are pleasing to God, have God in your life. But secondly, why don't you enjoy the life that you do have? Why don't you enjoy the wife of your youth, the children that you have, the house that you live in? Why don't you learn to be content and make the most of what you have? Because there's going to come a time where when you try to be a lion and never achieve that, no one remembers you anymore. You should have just tried to live the basic life of a dog. And I know that sounds rough, but his point is, you know, it's better to be humble than to be royal. To be humble and have God in your life than to be royal and not have God in your life. So then he doesn't leave us without hope. He doesn't leave us with a smile on our face. And I can almost see Solomon as he's writing this with a big smile, grinning from ear to ear, because he finally has come to the conclusion that he has messed up, that he has misused the time, the wealth, and the wisdom that God gave him, but he's still alive. And now that he has come to understand that he messed up, he knows that he can, from this moment on, change. And that's the beauty about God, isn't it? Remember the parable that Jesus talked about, the workers? He went and this landowner needed some work done on his field, so he went and hired some folks and agreed to pay him a certain amount of money. And after a few hours, he realized that the workers he had were not enough to get the job done, so he went and hired more people and agreed to pay them the same amount. And then still towards the end of the work day, he still needed more employees, so he went and got more and agreed to pay them a certain amount. And when it came time to pay, he started with the last ones that he hired and he gave them some money. And then the second ones that he hired, he gave them the same amount. And the first ones that he hired received the same amount, and they were indignant. They said, "Master, we worked all day long and you only paid us, let's say $50 for the day. And these folks only worked an hour or two. They got $50 too." And the point of the parable is this: it doesn't matter when you come to the Lord. The reward will be the same. What matters is that you do come to the Lord. What's important is that you do realize that God is everything and God is a master of this world, of everything, and that we need to submit to him. It doesn't matter when we come to him. What matters is that we come to him before we die. So this is Solomon now telling us in his way that he finally realized these things. And he's going to tell us how to get the most out of life. Go then, you know, that phrase there is quite important. You know, he's told us all these things in the first 6 verses of vanity of vanities, and that everyone dies. And once you're dead, you know, people forget about you, and it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. Then he says, go then, since all these things are true, why don't you just eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart? for God has already approved your works. I really love this passage. It speaks volumes to me at this point in my life. You can spend 60 years working, or 50, or however many years working for a company, a corporation, giving them everything, being at work on time, staying extra, working any extra shifts that they ask you, even working off the clock. You can give them everything, but you know what? Once they're done with you, you go right out the door. That watch that you got for 30 years service, or the plaque that you got for 40 years service, yeah, it's nice. But once you're gone, they'll forget you. So then Solomon says, instead of being so caught up in all those things, be content with what you have. Eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God is happy with you. That's what that means when he says God has already approved your works. It means God is content with you. God is happy with you if you make him the center of your life. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head. In other words, lift up your face. Don't be sad. Take off the mourner's clothes and put on the clothes of happiness and rejoicing. Why? Because God will never abandon you. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. For this is your reward in life, and in your toil in which you have labored under the sun. The Song of Solomon is the story about Solomon finding the woman that he's always been searching for. He is in love with her, head over heels. She is in love with him. You know, she has been waiting for her Prince Charming to show up. He showed up. He sings to her. He writes poetry. This is a woman that I want. So the day that he marries her, you know what Solomon does with her? He sits her right in the same place where the rest of his wives are sitting. Solomon says now, in his older years, enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life. He is not saying have a harem of 1,000 women at your disposal, but he's saying enjoy your wife. Your wife. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Do an honest day's work for an honest pay. Be honest with what you do, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, or the grave, where you are going. Once you're dead, everything stops. Once you're dead, your 401k doesn't mean much. Once you're dead, your 3-4 bedroom house doesn't mean much, right? So just enjoy your food, your drink. Enjoy the simple pleasures of life. I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. This is a passage that I like to call the hare and the tortoise. Remember that hare and the tortoise? That the hare thought it would win, it would beat the tortoise in a race, and he stopped and took breaks. But that tortoise kept on going, didn't stop, and he ended up winning the race. Well, this is what Solomon's saying. I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift. It doesn't, the most powerful, the most intelligent, the strongest. That's not who the race belongs to. In other words, they're not the ones that are going to win, because they're going to make it to the grave without God. The race is to the one that makes it to the grave with God in their lives. Notice the last phrase of verse 11. For time and chance overtake them all. So, what did he tell us here? How to get the most out of life. Celebrate every moment. Because as a child of God, there's no need to wear a sad face. And that's that put the white garments on. There's no need to be afraid of tomorrow. There's no need of what's going to happen tomorrow. There's no need to be anxious about what happens if I don't wake up tomorrow. Hebrews 13, I will never forsake you. I will never abandon you. Solomon also says, love your wife with commitment. Respect the covenantal relationship that you have with your wife, and live your life to the fullest. Make memories. How many of you would like to redeem time, go back in time rather, and throw another ball? Drink another RC Coca-Cola with peanuts with your son or your daughter. Can't do that anymore. It's gone. So this is why Solomon says in his old age, I should have, would have, could have, but I can't go back. So live your life to the fullest. And, you know, be satisfied with who you are. And I have this, I call this the selfie filter free. And for you older folks, you might not know what that means. But, you know, when what's common today is that folks would take pictures, you know, young kids would take pictures of themselves. They're called selfies, right? When you look at the phone and puff out your lips a little bit. And a filter is that these applications on the phones have filters where you can make yourself look, make yourself skin, makes your skin look smoother and remove any blemish that you might have, make you look thinner. And people post these pictures, and you see these pictures and you wonder, wow, these are model perfect pictures. But then you see them in real life, you wonder what happened. That's a result of people just not being content with who they are, what they look like, what they have, how much they have, where they live. Solomon is saying, look, just be content, be satisfied with who you are. Last few verses in Ecclesiastes 9, Solomon is going to reveal to us some things that, as I said, it's nothing earth-shattering. We already know these things. He's already talked about them, but he's going to remind us. Notice in verse 12, moreover, man does not know his time. That's interesting, right? He expresses in this verse that for many of us, death is going to come when we least expect it. And that's why he uses the illustration like fish caught in a treacherous net or birds trapped in a snare. So the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls on them. You know, a fish wasn't expecting to be caught, and neither was a bird expecting to be trapped in a snare. For some, death is going to come upon us that way. We won't know when our time is up. So if we know that we're going to die but don't know when, and that death can be unexpected, remember that passage we read from Peter? Since you know all these things, what sort of people ought you be? Verse 13, he also says, and I also came to see as wisdom under the sun, and it impressed me. Well, what did he see here? Let's just read the passage. There was a small city with few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom, yet no one remembered that poor man. What Solomon is saying is this: look, I've pondered about this. I've thought about this for a long time. And in the end, mind is greater than power. Mind over might. Because here comes this king with his army, and they have these fancy catapults or tanks or whatever. They have this great strategy and all this power, and they weren't able to deliver the city. But there was a poor wise man who through wisdom was able to deliver the city. He came up with a plan, a strategy to deliver the city. And then Solomon says, but no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. Unfortunately, the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. Uh, Solomon is probably saying, wisdom or common sense is found in people whom you least expect it. Just think about all of our politicians presidents that we have now, we've had in the past, and even in the future. Usually in our modern times, we will elect someone that has power, has might, has political clout, or very rarely will we elect a peanut farmer like Jimmy Carter, because the world despises, the world doesn't take into account that wisdom can be found in the simplest human beings. Being from the South and having spent most of my life with folks from the South, every once in a while I run into someone that's called a Yankee that thinks that all Southerners are toothless, ignorant hillbillies. And that's offensive. Solomon is saying wisdom is better than strength, but the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not needed. He also reminds us, notice in verse 17, that the words of the wise heard in quietness are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. We live in a time where people think that the louder they shout, the better they'll get their point across. But when you listen past the shouting and the screaming, they've said nothing. And Solomon says, the words of the wise heard in quietness are better. It makes sense. What they say makes sense. It's sound. Then finally, he concludes there in verse 18. He says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Now, let's consider this last verse of the 9th chapter and apply it this way. Let's say that you have spent all of your life building your business or your reputation. And then you make one grave mistake. How will people remember you? For the greatness or for that one mistake? And Solomon is saying wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy much good. Notice how he begins chapter 10, verse 1. You can have the most expensive perfume, but if one fly flies into that perfume, that whole perfume has been destroyed. So I think Solomon ends on this note. You know what wisdom is. You know where wisdom is found. Why don't you go there instead of everything else that he's been talking about? See, today, we need to make sure, while we still have life, that we're not overly concerned about the dead, because we can't do anything for them and they can't do anything for us. We don't need to be overly concerned about having a material wealth, because when we die, we can't take it with us. We don't need to be concerned about our own intelligence, because when we die, no one cares. We need to be concerned with a few things, and they're very simple. One, pleasing God, making sure that God is the center of your life. Secondly, enjoy the simple pleasures of life. That's wisdom. And that wisdom of enjoying life and having God in your life is better than having weapons of war. because in the end, the relationship that you have with God is what's going to give you hope. Thank you very much.